Hello everyone, I'm Jane Rumble. I'm head of the Polar Regions Department at the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office. I'm delighted to be joined today for this conversation about the changing Arctic by David and Crystal, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. So David, over to you first.
I'm a marine biologist who's studied the biology and chemistry of sea ice and the associated waters for several decades now in both the Antarctic and the Arctic. I'm currently the Professor of Arctic Ecosystems Research at the University of Helsinki in Finland.
Hello, I'm Crystal Martin-Lapenskie. I am an Inuk, which is singular for Inuit, and I'm originally from Nunavut, Canada. And I've had the absolute privilege of also working with the Inuit Circumpolar Council as their consultant when it comes to climate change, but also the planning and coordination of COP26.
Fantastic. So I'm delighted to be convening this climate conversation, which brings together people with different perspectives on climate. Today, as you've heard, we have David, who's a scientist, and Crystal, who is a representative of one of the indigenous peoples of the Arctic, to give their perspectives on how the Arctic is changing. We're often told that the Arctic is warming 3 times faster than anywhere else on the planet. And I think the evidence that we see in the media of the sea ice retreating, of increasing Arctic wildfires. I think in July, we had the lowest sea ice extent that we'd seen at that time ever previously. It was 48 degrees above the Arctic Circle in Siberia back in June. So these changes are kind of, the evidence of how much everything is changing. And of course, this brings greater interest in the region. There's more pressure for people to go and use the Arctic through shipping routes, more interest in hydrocarbon extraction, more mineral extraction, more kind of interest to go and visit the region and look at the climate change, but also a lot of concern about what's going to happen to iconic species like the polar bear and the whales and the seals and so on and so forth. I mean, that's just a kind of snapshot of what people will see in the media. But David, if we start with you, do you want to set out what are the key sort of science changes and challenges that you're seeing over the last kind of few years?
I guess I've really caught on with this quote from Mark Cerise, who's the director of the National Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. And he comes out with this phrase that the Arctic is losing its soul. And I think that's actually saying a lot, because we define the Arctic by the snow and the ice, the glaciers and the sea ice that you described. And they're now melting at a rate that's never been seen before. I've worked on sea ice since the early 1990s. And the textbooks that we were working from then and what we understood about sea ice then, they've been ripped up not just once, but they've been ripped up 2 or 3 times since, because there we had lots of ice that lasted for many years, was very thick, and that defined a lot of what the Arctic Ocean was. It defined the oceanography, and that's now completely different. We're getting, we think that by 2050 there will be very little summer sea ice left in the Arctic Ocean. And then you put into the whole permafrost thaw, the changing ecosystems, so species that were never seen in the Arctic before and now being recorded there, and species that were endemic in the Arctic before are struggling to survive. So we're getting at biodiversity changes as well. Rivers are changing, and what the rivers are putting into the Arctic Ocean are changing as well. So the constituents as the permafrost and material changes. So it is completely different than when I started going in the 1990s, and it is changing so very rapidly. So what we knew from 2021, we're going to have a very different scenario in 2022, and year by year, it's quite shocking the changes that we're recording.
It's kind of interesting, we were able to look at the Arctic and read about it and study it. But Crystal, I mean, this is your lived experience. So can you tell us, what is it like living in such a rapidly changing environment, and what do you see as the future for the region?
Yeah, thank you so much. I do have to echo what David had mentioned regarding the changes in wildlife. That's part of what Inuit are seeing in Arctic communities within the circumpolar region. Specifically looking at permafrost and the impacts of permafrost. The melting and the refreezing of permafrost really affects the infrastructure of our communities. We have no basements. You can't dig into permafrost. And so all of the houses are actually built above ground, poles that are holding them up or wooden frames that are holding the houses up. But each time permafrost melts and refreezes, it shifts the house, which is causing a lot of health issues as well. Because of mild that's building up in homes. And it has huge implications, not just within our food systems, not just within infrastructure, but also our health and our well-being. We know that mold is extremely dangerous to be breathing in, but many homes are filled with them. In Nunavut, where I'm from, there's a lot of homes that I've seen and families and friends that are sharing on social media pictures of what their house looks like. And you can see cracked walls that are right against the windows, and it's just filled with condensation and wetness that is right by, for example, electrical outlets, which is extremely dangerous as it is.
But I guess, Crystal, one of the other things that, I mean, do you see is the changing seasons as well, and this must be true for the food gathering. So we know that the changing ice conditions in the oceans and the seas are changing the whole seasonality of how the plankton are working and how and growing, and that has a knock-on effects for the rest of the food web. And I guess you're seeing that as well.
Yes, absolutely. There's a lot of changes that are happening in Arctic communities, and part of the challenge that we've been really pushing for as well is that Inuit see this within the circumpolar region. So Indigenous and local communities in the Arctic have real lived experience of these changes. They're seeing it every single day. Indigenous knowledge, for example, oral storytelling is part of our culture. It's part of who we are. And that's how we've been able to share experience, been able to survive. And our elders have been saying for decades now how the sky has changed and now it's unpredictable. And also with a lot of the wildlife that's coming into Arctic communities, different species that are going into the Arctic Ocean, like, for example, salmon. Salmon is now starting to make their way into Inuit communities, which have never traditionally been there. They're also seeing a lot of orcas in our communities. It has happened. Inuit have said, yes, we've seen orcas many, many moons ago, but now they're around our communities consistently, which is affecting our food chain as well, because Inuit still rely on seals. Inuit still rely on Arctic char, on whales, on walruses, but are now being impacted because of the orcas that are making their way into our traditional areas.
This may, for some people listening to this in the lower latitudes, seem a little bit remote. So why do they need to worry about what's happening in the Arctic more generally?
So there's a rather quaint phrase: "What happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic," and that has impacts on the rest of the globe. And that's absolutely true, because ocean circulation, weather patterns, I mean, we're seeing this now, strongly dominated by what's going on in the Arctic. There is no getting away from it. The whole of the globe is impacted by the Arctic changes, and the more rapid these changes are taking place compared to the rest of the globe, going back to the beginning of our conversation, the greater will there be the amplification of the effects of that on things like ocean circulation impacts and weather patterns as well. And also the biodiversity changes, the migration of animals in and out of the Arctic. I mean, there's a whole host of different species migrate into the Arctic and out of the Arctic, and that will be changing. And we don't have no clue about on what those changes will really mean.
And Crystal, I'm sure you've got perspectives on that, not least what the rest of the world maybe should learn a bit more from the way the Inuit have coped with the changes in the Arctic.
Absolutely. Just to David's point about, what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It's absolutely true. The Arctic is the natural refrigerator for the world. So any impacts that are happening in the Arctic is going to have detrimental impacts to the rest of the world. You're looking at more heat, but you're also looking at tornado warnings. Tornadoes never existed in this area before, and now we're seeing it. We're seeing the impacts like around the rest of the world, many people don't understand how their lives are going to change completely if we don't try and identify ways of bringing a stop to climate, or at least slowing it down very progressively.
One of the most primary examples of how the rest of the world is impacted is, of course, by sea level rise and all this glacial melt. We're getting an increase in sea level of about 3.5 millimeters per year. Now, this doesn't sound very much. It sounds tiny, but escalate that to the next 100 years, 200 years, 1,000 years. This is enormous volumes of water, and of course, whole communities are going to be hugely impacted by these sea level rises we're seeing that are, coming out of glacial melt, as well as other things as well.
Look at Greenland. Greenland have been experiencing tsunamis. Even a community where they cannot return to their community because it's just not possible anymore. These are huge issues. And looking at Inuit communities, Inuit are all coastal communities. We all live on the coastline in the Arctic waters. So the more glaciers melt, the more impact our communities will also have. I think of my hometown of Sanariak Nunavut, which is formerly known as Hull Beach. And when I think of my community, I get worried. I get worried because there's no mountains nearby. They're completely flat. What happens when sea level rises? My entire community could wash away from a tsunami. And these are real life issues. And it's scary. It is so scary to think about.
So imagine in a couple of weeks' time, you're zoomed unexpectedly into the negotiating room in Glasgow. What would you want to say to the assembled masses there? Crystal?
Take action. Our lives depend on it. Policy decision makers, state heads, everybody needs to really take a good look at what's happening in the Arctic and start working closely with Indigenous populations in the Arctic. And if they want to make meaningful changes, they need to start working closely with Indigenous populations.
Thank you, Crystal. And I see your daughter's just wandered into shot. And of course, this is really all about her future and the future of the next coming generations.
We've got to act so fast, and we've got to act so fast in the way that we fund our science and we do us and even report our science. The traditional way of doing science it's too slow for the changes that are taking place. We've seen that from the pandemic, haven't we? We really needed governments to work in a different way with the scientists that get the vaccinations produced. This is a very, very much bigger thing than the recent pandemic, and we need governments and funders and policymakers to really be investing in fast science that gets the answers quickly, so that we can actually make the decisions that are so pertinent for the future generations. So my advice would be bold and revolutionary in the way that we do the science, in the way that we're going to get the answers that we need to do the work that needs to happen.
Fantastic. I mean, the Arctic is clearly at the cutting edge of the climate change that we're seeing across the globe. I hope through this conversation we've inspired the next generation of scientists to think about what's happening in the Arctic and many people to understand what it's like to live in the Arctic and the dramatic consequences that climate change is having on those who have lived in those regions for such a long time. David, Crystal, thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This has been one of the episodes of the Climate Conversations, supported by the Natural Environment Research Council and Glasgow Science Centre. It's produced by Bespoken Media. Thank you so much for listening.